We are told in the early days of air guns, they shot these big round lead balls like this. So how on earth do we get from here to here? Welcome back to Canuck Air. I thought I'd take a few minutes to discuss how and why our airgun ammunition became these weird little skirted things, considering that they started out as big round lead balls. I mean, the great big air guns of centuries ago, so we're told, fired the same round lead ball that you'd see in rifles or muskets of the same day. Those air guns, though, were massive, custom-made, very expensive affairs. They were powered by high-pressure reservoirs, a lot like our PCP guns today, but back then you'd have them pumped up by your servants or other lackeys, most likely. But most of today's air guns are powered by the energy stored up in our biceps, or using little CO2 cartridges, and we like to shoot more than 8 or 10 shots in a single day. It only makes sense then to see airgun ammunition made lighter to keep those velocities up and reduce the amount of energy that it took to have some fun with them. But fire ammunition evolved over the centuries in a different direction. After shooting those mostly round lead balls, by the middle of the 19th century, they eventually began to go out of fashion and be replaced by longer bullet shapes, what we call that now. The bullet is essentially more lead stuffed into a longer shape, which allows for more contact with the rifle's barrel, especially if you're running it through rifling. And it makes the bullet denser, at least as it's presented to the air that it's trying to push through. It's what we call better sectional density. Those shapes help the bullet cut through that air better and hold more velocity longer, and more energy goes downrange. Modern high-power rifles use even longer and sleeker bullets than these ones here. But, and this is a big but, these bullets are heavier in the back than they are in the front. They'd rather travel the other way around. If the air catches them the wrong way, they will turn sideways. And this is what we call keyholing, as the bullet literally goes through the target sideways on. Not good for accuracy, because they can tumble in almost every direction as the wind kind of starts to catch them. Your grouping will go terribly. What keeps them pointed in the right direction is usually rifling. And that helps keep the bullet oriented aerodynamically as it spins it gyroscopically. We'll talk about that more later. But air guns ended up, by the early 20th century anyway, with what looked like cut-down badminton shuttles, but made out of lead. What gives with that? Well, it wasn't always so. Some air guns still shoot big round lead balls if you want. There are also smaller lead balls shot out of mostly European guns. And they use the round ball because they feed through magazines better. You can have continuous shooting. You don't have to keep putting little pellets into the gun, especially parlor shooting, things like that. In the United States, the American BB, of course, is well known. It started out as a round lead ball, BB sized, same as BB shot in the shotgun shells. But they were refined and improved, and sizes made a bit more uniform. And they're now made of steel, which is much cheaper than lead, less toxic, although they do ricochet a little better, if you like that kind of thing. But we're only talking about BBs here. Back to pellets, which is what we call our lead ammunition for more serious air rifles and air pistols nowadays. The pellet has two main forces it has to deal with as it's on its way downrange. First is gravity. It will fall to the ground pretty rapidly. If you want to know how long it takes for a bullet to fall to the ground, just simply drop one. It takes exactly the same time as when it leaves the muzzle, and it will hit the ground at exactly the same speed. Gravity is pretty universal force. How we keep them airborne longer is to point the muzzle slightly upwards, which is what the sights or scopes on our guns do. The second force is wind resistance. It's not trivial. We humans are well adapted to the pretty heavy, dense air that surrounds us, but pellets have to force their way through it on their way to the target. If you imagine you're traveling at, a bit less than 1,000 feet per second, that's still an awful lot of air you have to cut through, and it will slow you down considerably. All that wind resistance can cause our pellets to wobble in flight, and wobbles cause them to go off path, and you lose accuracy. The best way to keep them flying straight is by spinning them in a rifled barrel, like a spinning top. The gyroscopic motion fights any effort to tip the pellet from side to side. This little toy car right here, if I try to sit it upright on its head, it will fall over every time because, of course, it's heavier at the top than it is at the very bottom. But if I spin up the little gyroscope inside it, I can sit it on top of its head, and it will sit there quite comfortably until the gyroscope slows down enough that it again begins to tumble. And this is exactly what our bullets do as they're flying on the way to the target. But not all air guns benefited from rifling. Rifling was an expensive process, hard to do in small barrels, and not everybody wanted rifle barrels anyway. Indoor parlor shooting often involved shooting darts, bigger ones than these, often 25 caliber and things like that. And those guns were smoothbore because steel darts will tear out the rifling in your barrel and damage what you just paid all the extra money for. So smoothbore guns still ruled the roost for quite a while, and you could shoot lead balls out of them or darts. And by the late 19th century, you started getting little bullet-shaped things they called slugs. And they had smooth sides, and they were designed to just touch the rifling and hopefully fly straight. Sad news is they didn't always. There were various ways to try to keep them flying straight. One of them was to glue a piece of felt onto the back of it. These ones here are actually Sheridan 20 caliber slugs. They're not the genuine ones from the good old days. I haven't seen any of those around, but they do exist in some books. They show what they used to look like. But they call them felted slugs. They're fairly expensive, I guess, because you literally had to glue pieces of felt onto the back of them. But that piece of felt would provide a bit of extra drag, aerodynamic drag, on the back of the pellet and keep it pointing in the right direction, forward on its way to the target. And that worked quite well out of smoothbore guns back in the day. The felt on the back of the pellet performed the exact same function as fletches on an arrow. If you've ever had a cheap bow and arrow set as a kid, and they didn't have fletches on the back of the arrow, and you fire them, I remember a set that had suction cups on the front. It didn't take long before those arrows are literally traveling sideways towards the target, because that's kind of the natural way that things want to fly. It doesn't make sense to us. It's counterintuitive. You would think a pointy thing would want to fly in a pointy direction. But that's not how it goes. So little feathers on the back of an arrow will help provide a little bit of drag at the back end, keep the back end at the back, and the pointy end pointing forward, and you have a straight shooting arrow. And aside from airgun darts that have little tufty things on the back of them to keep them, again, pointing in the right direction, how do you do that best with an airgun pellet? Given that the felted slugs worked, but still not as well as they would like them to. By the early 20th century, and nobody knows exactly who the inventor was or what company, but the Diablo wasted pellet showed up on the scene, pretty much at the same time as the first mass-produced serious air rifles showed up. And usually people point to the 1905 H. Lincoln Jeffries design that was sold by BSA as being the first real grown-up air rifle that was in mass production. When I say serious, it was more of an outdoor gun as opposed to, some of the fancy parlor guns that were around in the decades before. But the Diablo pellet was well suited for the BSA rifle and the others that came with it, because what it is it's a design that puts weight at the forward end of the pellet, and the back skirt is hollow, and that skirt is there, just like it is on a badminton shuttle, to provide a little bit of drag. As the air flows around the pellet, the skirt part stays pushed to the back end of it, and the pellet flies on forwards. And what we don't often appreciate sometimes is that these were designed to work very well in smoothbore air rifles, which again were numerous back in those days. But they also worked really well, even better, in rifled air rifles, if you could afford one back then. Let me explain for a second what the word Diablo means. It is derived from diabolical, or devilish, but it refers to a toy. A Diablo was a spinning top, sort of like a yo-yo, but not actually attached to the string. You may have seen, buskers or carnival performers, quite talented at using the things. You could throw them up in the air and catch them back on the string. They spun at pretty high speed, and they kept their balance. And that's how our pellets got their name, although they don't spin quite the same way. But they've been with us for quite a while now, well over a century. I've got a tin here of fairly old Webley 22 special pellets, a number 2 bore, which is actually a slightly larger 22 caliber. A lot of English guns use a slightly bigger 22 than what we're used to now. These ones look a little rough and crude compared to these newer ones. This one's an RWS pellet, and this one here is a JSB made one for air arms. And yeah, but that is a domed Diablo pellet as we know them today. Now you can ask the question, what's the best shaped pellet to shoot? And the answer is pretty easy, the dome. That's it. All you need to know, dome pellets are the best. End of story. That's all you need to buy. Of course, that's not quite how it works. The dome pellet is seen as being dull and boring. Gee, that's what Dad used to shoot, or Grandpa used to shoot. And it seems so much cooler to have more interesting shapes available. Like pointed pellets, they seemed, more aggressive and dangerous, I suppose. I know that when the silver jet pellets showed up in the 1970s, early 80s, I can't remember when we first got some of those, they looked like the business. They were very well made. They had this point on them. They look so cool. Mount Star Silver Jets is what they were called. I think my dad still got the remainder of a box somewhere. These Stoger pellets look pretty similar to that design, and they're pretty cool. And they seem to do a better job than what else we were shooting. But other pellets improved their game. At least other pellet manufacturers improved their game over the years, and we started to see better and better made pellets. And once again, begin to recognize that the classic dome pellet is the most aerodynamic, most stable in flight. That's the best projectile to choose. But there's no denying that pointed pellets may actually penetrate a little bit better if you're shooting targets that's desirable. But funnily enough, of course, the other popular pellet on the market these days is a hollow point pellet, which is the opposite of a pointed pellet, but it supposedly is designed to expand or mushroom a bit as it hits a target. Usually you're in pest control or hunting with them with your air rifle, something I don't do, but doesn't stop me from having some hollow point pellets in my collection, like these daisies here. And the other classic pellet that everybody probably shoots with is the wadcutter pellet, with a very flat, sharp-edged front surface to them. And the main purpose of that is when it hits the target, paper target, it punches a crisp, clean hole, so it's a lot easier to score in competition. And if you're shooting air rifle or air pistol competition, that will be exclusively the pellet that you will use. Obviously, that flat front does not make them terribly aerodynamic, and they must lose velocity a lot quicker than you would with a dome pellet. But at the short distances that competitions are shot at, the pellet's still spinning furiously enough and fast enough and going fast enough that you've still got good accuracy. But if you are shooting at longer ranges, the dome pellet is king. And field target competitors, yeah, that's the pellet of choice. The irony of it is, of course, is that nowadays it's getting harder and harder to find decent dome pellets, especially at mass market stores, if your local hardware store and things like that, you'll find nothing but pointed pellets and hollow points on the shelf and wad cutters, and the dome pellets are nowhere to be seen. Obviously, if you're ordering in some higher quality pellets from the better manufacturers, domes are still available. But it does strike me as a bit odd as the very best pellet ends up being the one that's harder to get these days. Airgun pellets still come in several different sizes, and depending on what gun you got to have the right pellet for the job. The most common pellet, of course, that we're all familiar with is the 177 size, 4.5 millimeter if you're looking at the metric dimensions. And again, available in a wide variety of shapes and probably the most easy pellet to come across in whatever flavor you're looking for. And the other pellet that we're most familiar with is the .22 pellet, or 5.5 millimeter, and has the advantage of carrying a bit more energy downrange, but at the penalty of usually lower velocity in a gun of the same power or energy spec. In between those two, you've already seen this one, is the .20 pellet, or 5 millimeter, which was used pretty much almost exclusively by Sheridan Company. It was introduced by them back in the 1940s. Other manufacturers have flirted with the 20 caliber pellet. The argument there is that in between size gives you some of the velocity advantage of the 177 with a little more energy of the 22, but it never really took off, and Sheridan pellets are getting hard to come by for your Sheridan guns, but every now and again somebody gets excited about 20 caliber stuff. I don't have here a 25 caliber pellet, but that's another one that is making a bit of a comeback after being almost extinct in the pretty much died out between the wars, mainly because the guns that fired it just didn't have enough energy to keep the velocity flat, the trajectory flat enough, and they were slow enough that they're a bit more of a rainbow trajectory. The 22 caliber was considered superior, pretty much all around there. It's making a bit of a comeback now because, of course, manufacturers are flirting with more and more powerful guns. And there are other sizes available too. 30 caliber, or how about this one? 35 caliber. Yeah, still a Diablo pellet. The guns that shoot these, though, often they start turning towards things like slugs, either with hollow points and things like that, because they are usually designed for some sort of hunting or pest control purposes. And there are air guns even larger than this, of course, but they're usually shooting, again, either round balls or slugs. Pellets, I don't think, are generally being made for those. That's not really the point of those guns. Another nightmare when it comes to choosing pellets for your air gun is trying to figure out exactly what pellet suits it best. And there's no easy answer to that. You can't even take a recommendation from somebody else. If their air gun, which is the same model as yours, and he may get best results out of a particular pellet, and you try it and it's not quite as good, and you might find that a slightly different pellet does even better. And that's because barrels are made on different days, different weeks, different months, and they all may have slightly different dimensions. So you have to find out what pellet suits your gun better. For instance, I got two different pellets that look very similar in these cans here, JSB Exact. One is marked RS Diablo, the other one is Express Diablo. And the main difference is that the RS ones are slightly lighter, 7.33 grains is marked on the tin, and the other ones are marked 7.87 grains. And they make an even heftier one, just over 8 grains. And they all look almost exactly the same, and you can't really tell them apart unless you put them on little scales. But shoot them, and you'll find out that your gun prefers one over the other. Right now I'm finding, weirdly enough, that the lighter pellet seems to do better in my guns, but you have to try to find out. Now we come to the interesting topic of unusual airgun ammunition, stuff that veers away from the ordinary pellets. Now, back in the day, an ordinary pellet was just a domed Diablo pellet. That's what we all shot, that's what all the manufacturers made, although Crossman, for a while there, made just mostly the wad cutter pellets, the super pels. But, we were all familiar with the dome pellets. And I have to say, when the pointed pellets came out, like the silver jet pellets, they kind of fall into what we would now classify as a trick pellet, as in, little bit of pizzazz that sort of gives them a little bit extra interest and sparkle that, you're dying to try them out, see what they really do. And I'm as gullible as any of the rest of you. And those pointed pellets seem to be the business back then. Now, of course, pointed pellets are pretty much mainstream, and most manufacturers make several different types. So they're not quite as exotic as they once were. Hollow point pellets, though, I would still class as being a bit of a trick pellet, and there's some oddball designs out there. Some of them have weirdly lobed cavities in the front, sometimes there's saw teeth on the edges. Yeah, if you want to believe they do something special to your target, well then, by all means go ahead and buy them. But there's other weirder stuff out there. These ones here, these are the Predator Polymag with a polymer tip on them. I have found them to be actually really decently accurate pellets. They perform quite well. And some people have, documented that they're essentially a hollow point pellet with a little plastic tip put in there for a bit of extra aerodynamics, I suppose. Or maybe a little bit of extra penetration on game. I wouldn't know because I don't hunt with anything like that. But yeah, they're interesting pellets. They ain't cheap, but they do shoot well, so I can't criticize them at that point. These other ones here are from Gammo, and these ones, they're very similar to a pellet that I wished I could have found. Never did. I had a tin of pellets from Champion, I think they're Champion Bulldog or some British brand back in the day, and I noticed that the tin had a label stuck on it identifying the pellet. When I peeled the label off, I found that there was a pellet style called the Champion Ballistic painted on the actual tin, and it had a metal ball embedded inside the lead nose of it. I thought that seemed really cool, but never did see any pellets like that available for sale, at least not from Champion. And I gather, obviously, they must not have been successful because it looked like they were using up the old tins that they didn't use to put their regular pellets in them. So I'm guessing they didn't stay on the market. If they ever made it to market, I don't know. But these Gammo rocket pellets, they call them, do have, again, a hard metal ball embedded in the front, although the ball in this case is exposed and you can see it, and it's copper-plated. It looks like a copper-plated BB, but obviously it's actually too small for that. I'm pretty sure it's too small for that. But, yeah, interesting pellets. Obviously the idea is they're extra hard, so they'll punch through tin cans better, that kind of stuff. Yeah, again, they're fairly expensive, but look like they're kind of fun. If they shoot straight. I think I did try them out, and I can't remember how well I did with them. Other pellets that fall in the trick category are these ultra-light ones with a plastic polymer skirt with some sort of a hard alloy body put through them with a slightly pointed end on them. They're quite light. They do go faster. I have yet to find anything that shoots these things straight. They seem to go all over the place, so very expensive. I've had them around for a long, long time, and yeah, I don't shoot them because they don't do very well. Unlike the sucker I was, I bought a similar one, but in 177 caliber with a flat nose on them. Again, they don't shoot very well at all, at least not in anything that I've got. Other weirdo pellets you might come across. These ones are copper-plated ones from Stoeger, but there's other brands out there dabbling with copper plating. I can't see how they'd really do anything of any practical value. It's not as if you generate enough velocity in an airgun to worry about leading your barrel. And there's other weirdo stuff out there as well, and your mileage may vary, but again, the best pellet shape is likely the domed Diablo pellet, unless you're shooting at close range where wad cutters punch nicer holes, and pointy pellets may have their advantages once in a while. Here's another pellet that is worth talking about. It's not really a trick pellet. It is simply an alternative to the conventional lead pellet that we all know. These are made of an alloy, a tin alloy most usually, and they're designed designed for use in environments where lead is restricted, which is becoming more and more common these days. They end up being more expensive than lead, and they also weigh a bit less, which these pellets here, these Stoeger ones, weigh only 5.56 grains, and not all guns are going to be very happy with that. But They are part of the airgunning future, and they are improving here and there. Not really a trick pellet, but certainly one of the more unusual ones you'll come across out there. So I was thinking about some interesting experiments I could perform based on just pellets. And one that came to mind is, in one of my earlier videos, I showed you the renovation of a Shakespeare Acro 1. And I have a parts gun that's pretty similar. And the Acro 1 that I refurbished has a rifle barrel in it. But the parts gun is an earlier model, and it has a smoothbore barrel. And the neat thing is, it's not too hard to swap the barrels out in those guns. So what if I took it to the range and shot it with the rifle barrel and the smoothbore barrel and see how the accuracy is or isn't affected? The whole point of Diablo pellets is they're supposed to shoot fairly well out of smoothbore barrels. And the Diana 15, which is a smoothbore, low-powered gun, at least not too low-powered, but not terrible, that Diana 15 shot actually quite well with smoothbore, with its smoothbore barrel and 177 Diablo pellets. So I was curious, maybe I'll do that with the Acro 1. Give that a shot. So here we are trying it out. The far left target, we have a 28mm group fired through the rifle barrel. Switched the barrels over, point of aim's a little different, but got a 28mm wide group again, but stretched out a bit 47mm vertically. That might be because the pellets was a little too hefty for that gun. Another experiment that I thought of was I wondered just how much velocity an airgun pellet, a Diablo airgun pellet, loses on its way to the target. I can compare that with an actual firearm bullet like this 22 caliber CB short, which is a very low caliber bullet. We could run it across the chronograph at the muzzle and at downrange and see just how much velocity we lose with each type of projectile. And again, the interesting thing about airgun pellets is they're designed to lose velocity rapidly. That's kind of the whole point. And people often don't appreciate that. Firearm bullets are designed to keep their velocity as long as possible, which of course makes them dangerous up to a mile or more. But airgun pellets are supposed to slow down fairly rapidly and drop to the ground harmlessly within, say, a couple hundred yards at most. So let's just see, I wonder, what we get when we try them at the range. So here's the results. The dome pellets dropped from 635 down to 591 over just 20 yards. The wad cutters went from 645 to 555 over 20 yards. The pointed pellets only did barely better, from 644 down to 560. Which does mean at the end of the day, the dome pellets are losing 13.3% of their energy, the wad cutters 25.9%, and the pointed only barely better at 24.5%. In comparison, the CB shorts lost only 1.4% of their energy over that time period. Isn't that amazing? So I have to admit, the results were a little more surprising than I thought. The 22 shorts were remarkably aerodynamic, I guess, and lost very little of their energy. Whereas the pellets clearly are designed to lose energy, drop to the ground quickly, which is what makes air guns considered to be more benign, less dangerous, and more neighborhood friendly, I suppose. Getting into PCP guns that push the boundaries of airgun power and try to get shooting slugs up to close to 22 rimfire velocities and energies, I think just at the end of the day just invites more government regulation and interference. So my vote, I'm still happy with the wasted pellet. I think they work just great. So anyway, hope you enjoyed this little adventure in airgun nerdology, at least when it comes to pellets. And thanks for watching. Consider subscribing, and I'll be back again soon with something else equally fun, I hope.